Would you execute your own wife to get what you want? King Henry VIII of England did, not once, but twice. He changed his country's religion and sent even those closest to him to their deaths, all in pursuit of one obsessive goal: a male heir. In his 36-year reign, 1509 to 1547, this desperate quest for a son drove Henry VIII to annul 2 marriages and behead 2 of his 6 wives. How did a cultured Renaissance prince become a blood-soaked tyrant, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for a male heir? The answer is a chilling tale of ambition, betrayal, and brutality. Henry VIII was once a charismatic young prince, celebrated for his intellect and athleticism. But as the years passed without a son, a darkness grew. The Tudor dynasty was new and fragile. Henry's father had seized the throne after decades of civil war. No son meant no secure succession, and Henry was haunted by the fear of England plunging back into chaos if he left only a daughter as heir. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, bore him only a daughter, Mary, and several stillborn children. By his 40s, Henry's anxiety for a male heir had twisted into obsession. Was God punishing him? Henry convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine, who had been his brother's widow, was cursed and unlawful, which was why God denied them a son. He became determined to set Catherine aside and try again with a new wife, no matter the consequences. In 1527, Henry petitioned Pope Clement VII for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. He fully expected the Pope's blessing. Other royals had gotten divorces, so why not a king? But in a twist of fate, the Pope was effectively the prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Under pressure from Charles, the Pope refused to dissolve Henry's marriage. This was an unprecedented slap to Henry's will. How far would the king go to get his way? Henry's answer was shocking. If the church stood in his way, he would break the church. Henry defied the Catholic Church and in 1533 took the drastic step of creating his own church. He had England's bishops declare his first marriage invalid and proclaimed himself the supreme head of the Church of England, severing obedience to the Pope. This English Reformation upended centuries of religious life. Henry uprooted the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1540, over 800 abbeys and convents were ruthlessly dissolved, their treasures seized and monks and nuns cast out into the streets. The Pope excommunicated Henry, but it was too late. The king had remade the very soul of his kingdom in pursuit of an heir. And what of Queen Catherine? After 20 years as his loyal wife, she was unceremoniously discarded. Henry stripped Catherine of her title and banished her to isolated castles, where she lived in cold, miserable conditions until her death. He even forbade their daughter Mary from seeing her. The heartbroken Catherine died in 1536, separated from her only child and reduced to a footnote in Henry's relentless march toward a son. No one was spared Henry's ambition, not even his own family. Meanwhile, Henry had already wed the woman for whom he'd risked everything, Anne Boleyn. The king was captivated by Anne, a vivacious court lady who promised him the son he craved. In 1533, while the ink was barely dry on Catherine's annulment, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. She soon gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The disappointment was palpable. Anne would conceive at least 2 more times, but those pregnancies ended in miscarriages, including, tragically, a boy. The pressure on Anne was unbearable. Henry's entire legacy hinged on her producing a son. What happens to a queen who can't deliver what the king desires? Anne Boleyn was about to find out in the most brutal fashion. Only 3 years into their marriage, Henry's passion for Anne had soured. By 1536, the once adored queen faced a nightmare. She was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason against the king. Historians widely believe these charges were false, concocted simply so Henry could be rid of Anne and free to marry yet again in his quest for a male heir. Anne Boleyn was dragged to the Tower of London as a traitor. On May 19, 1536, the 35-year-old queen stepped out onto Tower Green to meet her fate. Anne Boleyn spent her final days imprisoned in the Tower, awaiting execution. In a mercifully swift end, she was beheaded by a skilled French swordsman with a single stroke, rather than the clumsy axe normally used. The public watched in horror as the sword flashed and Anne's head was severed from her body. Henry had ordered his once beloved wife executed, her only crime being her failure to bear a son. The very next day, the king celebrated his engagement to his third wife. Such was Henry's cold resolve. As one courtier observed, the morning air never smelled so sweet as it does today, believing England was rid of an unwanted queen. Little did they know the bloodshed was far from over. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gave him what he wanted. In October 1537, Jane delivered a healthy baby boy, Prince Edward. Henry, nearly 46 and gray-haired, wept tears of joy as he held his infant son. At last, a male heir, England's future seemed secure. But fate dealt a cruel hand. Jane died from childbirth complications only days later. Henry was devastated. He had loved Jane dearly for giving him a son. He would later call her his true wife and have Jane buried beside him. Still, nothing would stop Henry's drive to solidify his dynasty. Within a few years, he married again and again. His fourth marriage, to Anne of Cleves, was a diplomatic match that Henry quickly regretted. He divorced her in mere months. Thankfully, Anne of Cleves kept her head and lived out a quiet, comfortable life. But Henry's fifth wife would not be so fortunate. Catherine Howard was a teenaged lady-in-waiting over 30 years younger than Henry. The aging king was instantly besotted with her youthful beauty. He married Catherine Howard in 1540 and blissfully called her his rose without a thorn. Yet less than 2 years later, this rose's petals were drenched in blood. Rumors swirled that young Catherine had been unfaithful. Henry, now obese, diseased, and paranoid, flew into a possessive rage. The 19-year-old queen was accused of treasonous adultery and condemned to death. In February 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded at the Tower of London, just like Anne Boleyn before her. It's said Catherine asked for the executioner's block the night before her death so she could practice placing her head on it. On the scaffold, trembling, she declared that she died a queen. But I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper, referring to her alleged lover. The sword fell and another of Henry's wives perished. Henry VIII had now executed 2 of his queens with his own signature. Who could possibly feel safe in such a court? Henry VIII did not reserve his brutality only for his wives. As his reign progressed, he became increasingly merciless toward anyone who defied him, be they trusted advisors, former friends, or even blood relatives. Disloyalty was death. One of the first to learn this was Sir Thomas More, Henry's friend and chancellor. More could not in good conscience sanction Henry's break with Rome and refused to acknowledge the king as supreme head of the church. For his principled stand, More was beheaded in 1535, mounted on a London bridge as a warning to others. Henry felt no remorse in sending his old friend to the chopping block. The message was clear: agree with the king or die. Even Henry's right-hand men eventually met tragic ends. Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant architect of Henry's Reformation and the very man who helped engineer Anne Boleyn's downfall, fell from favor after arranging Henry's ill-fated marriage to Anne of Cleves. In 1540, Henry's vengeance was swift and shockingly unjust. Cromwell was arrested, attainted without trial, and beheaded on Tower Hill. Henry would later mourn Cromwell as the most faithful servant he ever had, but the damage was done. The fickleness of Henry's mercy meant that one day you were the king's beloved advisor and the next day you were quite literally dead to him. The tyrant king's wrath extended even to those of royal blood. Early in his reign, Henry had Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, executed merely for being a potential rival with royal Plantagenet blood. Decades later, in 1541, he turned against another Plantagenet relative, Lady Margaret Pole, a 67-year-old countess who had committed no crime besides being the mother of a critic and a distant heir to the throne. Henry imprisoned the elderly woman in the Tower and eventually signed her death warrant. What followed was one of the grisliest executions of the age. Because the usual executioner was unavailable, a clumsy youth was tasked with the beheading. He literally hacked the frail lady to pieces, requiring 11 blows of the axe to finally sever her head. Witnesses were horrified at the spectacle. Henry had made his point in rivers of blood. No one with a claim to his crown, however remote, would be allowed to live. Common people, too, felt the terror of Henry's rule. When a large rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace rose in the north in 1536, protesting the king's religious upheavals, Henry promised to listen to their grievances. But it was a trap. Once the rebels dispersed, Henry had the ringleaders hunted down and brutally executed, some hanged, drawn, and quartered as traitors. He even targeted abbots and monks who had supported the uprising, displaying their rotting heads on town gates as a ghastly warning. Fear crept into every corner of England. Henry's government passed laws making it treason even to speak ill of the king. Merely uttering dissent could get you executed horribly. By the late 1530s and 1540s, Henry VIII had fashioned a regime of terror. Once praised as a generous, bluff King Hal, he was now widely feared as a capricious tyrant. One contemporary ambassador lamented that Henry's court had become a shark tank. Anyone could fall victim to the king's suspicions at any moment. In January 1547, Henry VIII died at last, obese, diseased, and spiritually broken. The athletic Golden Prince of Youth had become a temperamental monster by the end. His hands were soaked with blood from the executions of wives, courtiers, and thousands of his subjects. So brutal was Henry's rule that when the 55-year-old king lay on his deathbed, even his closest attendants felt relief as they watched their tyrannical monarch take his final breaths. Henry's long-sought dream of a male heir seemingly had come true. 9-year-old Edward VI succeeded him. But the victory was hollow. The boy King Edward was frail. He died at just 15 years old without offspring. In the end, Henry's dynasty passed to his daughters, the very scenario he dreaded. His first daughter, Mary, and later his second daughter, Elizabeth, would rule after him. Ironically, that little girl, Elizabeth, born of Anne Boleyn, would become one of England's greatest monarchs, the legendary Gloriana, far outshining her father. Henry's obsession with a male heir had forever altered England's course. The Church of England was established on his whim, and countless lives had been destroyed to secure Tudor rule. History remembers him as a larger-than-life figure who achieved great things. Terrible, yes, but great. His legacy is a bloody testament to absolute power and the lengths one man would go to immortalize his name. So, was it all worth it? Henry VIII got his son for a few brief years, but at an unfathomable cost in human lives and suffering. His reign teaches a dark lesson. When a ruler's ambition turns to tyranny, no one is safe. If this tale of power and paranoia fascinated or horrified you, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping history stories told bold and unflinching. We have many more dark chapters to explore, and you won't want to miss them.